Hey guys, great news. The Rogue Historian podcast is back. And you know what? It's better than ever. We were on a 3-year hiatus and I just couldn't stand it anymore. I had to go off into the world and talk to people about their fascinating work. For my very first episode in this new relaunch, I have invited Dr. Stephen A. Goldman on, who just wrote the book, just published this book, One More War to Fight, Union Veterans Battle for Equality Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Lost Cause. Here's the book. Buy the book. You can get the link down there. It is fantastic, especially if you're interested in veterans stuff. Steve is a psychiatrist and has a unique perspective into the worldviews, the psyche, the motivation, all the stuff that veterans think about after their combat experience. And he talks also about their commitment to equality in the post-war. Now, that might be a controversial topic, so I think you should listen to the show and see what he has to say. Very compelling evidence. So listen up, and I hope you enjoy the show. I'm happy to be back, as you can plainly see.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, it is.
Literally.
Okay, look, yeah, it is good to see you. So you're in the Old Dominion, right?
No, I'm in Maryland.
Why did I think you were in Virginia?
No, I'm in the Free State.
You're Virginia. You're Virginia adjacent.
Yes, it's called the DMV, by the way,
Uh-huh.
which it became an acronym. I'm sorry, the DMV is Department of Motor Vehicles. I mean, I've never understood this new acronym, but yes, we're in the DMV.
Okay. Well, then there you have it. That sounds weird. I mean, that would actually, like, in LA, if you have to go to the DMV, you automatically break out in hives and cold sweats because it's a day, and then they'll screw it up. The LA bureaucracy will absolutely, without question, screw that up. But I go through there at least once a year. I take my kids to on a field trip, and last year we dropped by the Antietam battlefield for not nearly enough time. And I don't know that we're going to get to Antietam this year, but I don't know. We should, when I'm there, we should definitely connect at some point.
I'd love to. As a matter of
At some point.
fact, the place that I've been doing a lot of work
Mhm.
with and the personnel at NPS is Monocacy, which
Mhm.
is a sensational site. Have you been there?
I've never been there, and it's and I need to get there. That's a cool spot in a story, and that's something I'd like to check out. Lou Wallace fought there, right?
Yeah,
That
I mean,
yeah.
yeah, I've got a new article that I'm writing on sort of the backstory between
Mhm.
Wallace, um, John W. Garrett, who was the president of the B&O Railroad, and one of the commanders that Lew Wallace had in his, I'm not going to call it a ragtag army because it wasn't a ragtag army,
Mhm.
but what Lew Wallace did there was remarkable. I mean, it was
Mhm.
outstanding, and in usual historical precedent, he was cashiered almost immediately after the battle.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to write Ben-Hur, and then Charlton Heston stars in that film in the '50s, and it's a great film. And
Have you ever seen the silent version
no, I
with
have
Ramon
not.
Navarro? Which, by the way,
You're
is out.
you're a film guy, so you definitely be into this one. No, I have not
The,
seen the silent version.
the silent version is with Francis X. Bushman and Ramon
Mhm.
Navarro. The chariot scene is easily as good in the silent, if not better.
Cool.
And William
All right.
Wyler, who of course directed the '59 version,
Uh-huh.
was an assistant director on the silent version.
That's cool. I got to check this out.
Yeah, TCM, bless it, often
Hmm.
shows the silent version,
Hmm.
which, by the way, is remarkably good. And one of the things that TCM has been really terrific about is explaining how the acting was very good in making the silence because, of course, there's no sound.
Hmm.
And try acting with no sound.
It was a whole different world, and I've spent a lot of time studying Birth of a Nation, which of course is right in my bailiwick,
Right.
and the acting is so. I mean, these guys are stage actors, and they come to the screen, and their gestures and their facial expressions and all these kinds of things have to convey so much, that you can't be done with words. But so hey, let me give you a proper introduction. God, I'm rude. Everybody, my friends, my listeners, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Goldman to our show. Steve, thank you so much for coming on. You are the author of a most exceptional book, One More War to Fight: Union Veterans Battle for Equality Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow and the Lost Cause. I really like this book. This is right up my alley because this is, my work's been on Union and Confederate veterans, for my entire professional career. So I read this. I was very eager to get my hands on this. I read it and very much enjoyed the things that you had to say. And there's lots and lots and lots for us to talk about here, of course. But my first question to you has to deal with your professional life as a psychiatrist. Because typically these books are written by academic historians, and and all that comes with that, and you come to this, I think, with a unique perspective, because you are in the world, in that world, in the medical world, psychiatry, and you come to look at Union veterans, and I believe that you have certain insights that an academic historian would not, because you can tap into their psyche. You can tap into things that I don't necessarily think that academic or historians are. Well, I'm sure we could figure it out, but we're not trained to look for certain things. And you are. So I would love to hear what you have. First of all, why are you interested in Civil War veterans as a psychiatrist? What brought you to Civil War veterans, and what unique insights do you think you have when you were examining these guys?
Oh, first of all, thanks for the wonderful intro.
Sure,
And
man.
again, a shout out to your work. I've been a lifelong Civil War buff. One of the first trips we took, I was 8 years old, was the first time we went to Gettysburg and parts of Virginia. And that's number one. Number two, as I point out in the acknowledgement in One More War to Fight, I came of age during the Vietnam era. And like so many people who grew up during that time, it was life shaping. And I've always been interested in those who've gone to war. My grandfather served in World War I, although he was stateside. My father served the entire Korean War as a physician, stateside. My brother spent 20 years in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel, also a physician. And my father-in-law was, unlike John Wayne, who never served, my father-in-law was the real deal. He landed at Utah Beach, fought in the Battle of Bulge, strung wire behind enemy lines, and as a first-generation American Jew, was a concentration camp liberator. And he was a tremendous resource for me and a validator of the material, as have so many of the veterans I've both worked with and also I've been lecturing on this for 25 years and working on this for 25 years in terms of the books, the book and other books. And I also worked for the VA, which was just an amazing experience. And I really appreciate the point that you're making. My friend, Dr. Jim Brummel, who runs the Civil War Institute at Shepherd University, makes a similar point to you do, that there are things that I would bring that, frankly, an academic historian would not bring, because my focus is the experience of combat. And when I talk about the experience of combat and military service, inevitably it's portrayed as almost uniformly negative. When in actuality, and these are two things I want to say right off the bat, and this is as someone whose entire psychiatric career has spanned the formulation and refinement of post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis, that the vast majority of men and women who go to war, including those who are in combat, do not manifest PTSD. And that's one thing, which again we can discuss further. And the second aspect is that having served, in particular those who've been in combat, is life-altering in ways that, in many ways, are extremely positive. And there is a tendency in the academic historical realm, both in Civil War and others, to portray those who've been to war as grievously wounded, both psychically and, of course, physically, and as damaged. And I can tell you that, having spent decades both treating and working with veterans, which has been a highlight of my career, veterans resent this image because it's very much at variance with what we know about veterans. And people may not be aware that there are two long-term ongoing studies about Vietnam veterans, for example, that show what many of us know is that they've been an extremely successful veterans group in their marriages, in business, in politics, and in society. So you asked about my motivation. I wanted to link two things that frankly had not been written about, as you know. The tremendous political activism of Black and white Union veterans after the Civil War. That's, of course, one of the main themes of my book. The second paired theme is the survivor obligation. Note, I don't say survivor guilt, survivor obligation to having been given the gift of survival. You utilize that to change your society when you return from war. And there are great examples of this. You know, in our own time, John Kerry is one of the finest examples of that. And he wrote a marvelous memoir called Every Day is Extra. In the Civil War realm, one of the great memoirs is Rufus Dawes's memoir, you know, service with the
Wisconsin, I think.
Sixth Wisconsin, which is an outstanding book. And you know, so these books are out there. And then, of course, you have people like Eugene Sledge, the Marine writer from World War II, again, who wrote two great books. The second book, China Marine, is actually about his return home, which they utilized in the fabulous series, The Pacific.
Right.
Matter of fact, I mean, if you've seen it, as good as Band of Brothers was, the Pacific was even better.
I tend to agree. Yeah, I like the Pacific.
And that last episode, again, right out of his book, Bob Lecky's book, and what they knew about John Bazelon, that scene where he goes to hunt and he can't do it. Again, absolutely true. And again, let me give you a movie citation, which was exactly replicated beautifully. The finest scene in The Deer Hunter.
Yes.
And that beautiful scene where the one-shot purist Michael sights on the buck and he can't bring himself to shoot. It's such a beautiful scene. You know, so the kinds of things you're talking about have been my life, and I've been honored to be brought into the fraternity of men and women who've been to war, because as you may know, they don't talk about this a lot with people outside the fraternity. Having, as a psychiatrist and someone who's worked with veterans groups, I've been privy to what it's like and these discussions, and the material in One More War to Fight and other books I have written and I'm planning to publish have been burnished by decades of lecturing, working with veterans, and their validation of my conclusions. And so One More War to Fight is only the first in what I hope will be a series of explorations of what, as you're pointing out, is really not the mainstream of academic Civil War and Reconstruction history.
You know, this is really fascinating to me because, as you probably know, I've had people on the podcast in the past who have embraced what we now think of as sort of the dark turn of Civil War history. You've probably heard about this. Specifically, I've had Sarah Henley Cousins, Jonathan Jones, and Diana Miller Somerville on the show, all three of whom have written extensively about what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't call it that in the 19th century. This is a 20th century thing, but written extensively about the dark side of the veteran experience, the increased opium addictions, the increased alcoholism, the increased rates of suicide, the increased rates of domestic abuse that they've all pointed out. But you're saying that conversely, this experience may be exceptional, or is this something, you know, those experiences may be sort of statistical outliers perhaps, and that really the veteran experience is a much more positive one?
Yeah, this is a great question you're asking me. First of all, let's handle suicide. up until the last 15, 20 years with the volunteer army, veterans have had a suicide rate that is lower than the general population.
Mm-hmm.
There is no evidence that the suicide rate in Civil War veterans, World War I veterans, World War II veterans, or Vietnam veterans was in any way higher than the civilian population. And I have the stats to show that.
Mm-hmm.
This is a fairly new phenomenon. That's number one. Number two, the historians are not versed in the psychiatric literature as a psychiatrist who's treated PTSD or diagnosed would be. I'm not being difficult when I say that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole literature out there that they would not know, or if they dip into, it's not the same knowledge base. That dark side completely ignores the power of the warrior identity.
Mm-hmm.
The very thesis of my book, and again, I mean, wouldn't you agree, Keith? I believe I prove what I set out to show, is that if Civil War veterans were devastated, damaged men, how could they possibly have formed the most important political bloc in service of African American equality for decades? How could they have formed the most influential veterans groups in American history, the Grand Army of the Republic? And let me give you a stat on that to refute some of the things that have been written about, frankly, my book in a couple of places. Up to 1/2 of all of Union veterans, black and white, were members of the Grand Army at some point. That's more than 1 million men.
Right.
This is not a tiny sample. This is a huge sample.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, my focus, as you know, was the Grand Army. And with marvelous material that, frankly, I dug up, including the debate when they refused to draw the color line, which,
Mm-hmm.
of course, was the height of the Grand Army, when they rose to their greatest importance, was when they refused to draw a color line. And that refutes some of these things that have been written, because men who are that damaged don't do this.
Right.
How many presidents who were veterans served until Grover Cleveland? They were all Union veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And including Grant, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And the sample that I use, the left arm corps, which is a highly representative sample. And I know that you love the idea. And by the way, my next book is almost exclusively about the left arm corps.
I really like these guys. I've never heard of them, and I'm a guy that writes about veterans, and sometimes these groups kind of come out. Where do these guys come from? They're a really interesting group.
They're awesome. Now, this book was really not about the left arm corps. I mean, they're included, but it's about all Union veterans.
They do take a prominent role in
they
the
have a prominent role,
right.
But I took great pains to say that they're a representative sample, but they are not the focus of the book, as you know. My next book, which is my actual Civil War book, which also is groundbreaking in similar ways, is specifically about the left arm corps, where they came from, how they were constituted, how incredibly representative they were, because they were absolutely identical to 61 and 62 enlistees, which makes it a perfect sample. They were a national sample, which you never find. 98% of them were enlisted men, which you never find. And the only one that's analogous is, you know, Jim McPherson's great For Cause and Comrades. His sample was not nearly as representative because 40% of them were officers. It was both Confederate and Union. And again, it's no criticism of Jim. I mean, his book is terrific, but the sample wasn't representative. And also his book stops with the Civil War.
Right.
Mine doesn't, either book. So so these are all terrific points. I'm not claiming that one sample of 268 men answers all these questions, but that's not the only information I use, as you know. The other thing is, the vast majority of my references in One More War to Fight and in the next book that will come out hopefully this year are primary material. Now, I do use other historians such as yourself, you know, terrific material, but I don't depend predominantly on other historians, and I don't depend on other historians for interpretation for the reasons that we're mentioning. And I do bring something different to the table here. because as far as I know, this is the only Reconstruction book that is told essentially, almost exclusively from the viewpoint of Union veterans. I mean, that this is not, like Eric Foner's marvelous book, America's Unfinished Revolution, which again ended with Reconstruction.
Mhm.
As you know, with my book's really getting started when Reconstruction ends,
Right.
because it goes right into 1913. And I'm trying to tie in the themes of, which you did so beautifully, where what reconciliation did, with Jim Crow, which I emphasize. I talk a lot about, about the Freedmen's Bureau above the Mason-Dixon line, which a lot of people don't even realize. In border states, there were Freedmen's Bureaus in the border states. It was not just in the former Confederate states. And I also emphasized the great achievement of the Freedmen's Bureau in the decades that followed was in education. So again, and I focus a lot on what changed in the North rather than the South when it came to desegregation, particularly the state of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, which again, I don't think a lot of people were aware of. And I tried to make it clear that Reconstruction had implications, first of all, beyond the South, that the legislation and the three critical amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, enabled African Americans to use the courts for the first time. And I hope you agree. I think I made a compelling case for that when I showed the examples that I had. And of course, I used Robert Pinn, the remarkable man of color who was in the Left Arm Corps, one of the first African Americans to be awarded the Medal of Honor. And he goes to Cairo, Illinois, and tries desperately to bring an educated African American veteran's viewpoint to the education of Black children. And he tries. And what obstacles he runs into in a city that is putatively above the Mason-Dixon line, but Southern Illinois might as well be below the Mason-Dixon line, given
Right.
what the racial so what I tried to do, Keith, was to tie these themes together with material that has not been presented before, with an emphasis that's not been made before, and frankly, with the perspective of someone who has worked with veterans for so many years, has seen what they've done in the United States to change our society and continue to do in the United States in our society. And we had a great example of that when General Mark Milley retired. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He gave one of the finest talks I've ever heard when he retired. The president was there, everybody was there, and it was televised live. And what did he talk about? He talked about one thing, that American military men and women don't swear an oath to a president, a monarch, or as he put it, a potential despot. They take an oath to one thing: to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I've taken that same oath twice myself. Once when I went to work for the VA, and once when I went to work for the Food and Drug Administration, Health and Human Services. Same oath. When you've taken that oath, it's life altering, because you become part of something so much larger than yourself. That's what veterans do. And those who have gone to war and return and continue that obligation to their society, what could be more inspiring and magnificent to tell that story? And that's what I try and do.
This is to me, this is something that I think we need to really think very carefully and very deeply about as we study veterans, not only the Civil War, but veterans of all wars.
Oh, absolutely.
But when we think about the Civil War, and this is my area of expertise, I suppose, and I've read the literature, as you have read all the literature on veterans, and I think often of a couple of things. One thing I think about a lot is Thomas Presley's old book from the 1950s, Veterans Interpret Their Civil War. So it's a good book. It's 70 years old now, and it's an interesting book to read as you're just getting started there. But he says something in here about white Union veterans and their relationships or their understanding of freedom in the fight that they
Oh
waged
yeah.
to to free people from bondage. And there's something interesting here, and there's like a very rare example of an army marching into war as an army of liberators.
You got it.
You know, but how Presley frames it, and the veteran interpretation of this, as he calls it, that they embraced a sense of moralizing self-righteousness, right? And I think I think that's true. They got to put a feather in their cap, and if you read their speeches, you know, if you read their, this is my, you know, I'm revising my thoughts on this right now as we speak, because I'm working on another project, and I want your thoughts on it. I'm curious what your take is on this. But my whole thing was like, yeah, I kind of got into that phrase, you know, this sense of moralizing. They got to put the feather in their cap, and they got to go out in front of people, despite what a lot of the literature says, is that Union veterans turned their backs on Black people in the wake of the war, and for the sake of reconciliation.
I couldn't disagree more, as you know.
Yeah, and I had a problem with this too. You know, and I argued against Blight's Race and Reunion, which I think is a fine book, and David Blight's a great guy, and I love his work, but I disagreed with that point on him, and I argued against it only because the Union veterans themselves say it in speech after speech after speech after speech, monument dedications, and 4th of July parades, and you name it, right?
For decades afterwards, let's point out.
Well into the 20th century, they're saying this very same thing. But I'm starting to fine tune that a little bit. Not to say that they're saying that only as a way to get their names in the papers or to make them feel good about themselves, but really as a genuine feeling that they have captured a component of American exceptionalism, right? That's, and this is a very 19th century American exceptionalism these days gets a bad rap. I don't think people really dig deep enough to understand what it means. I think they think it means, mindless hubris, or at the worst, white supremacist. I don't think people really understand what a 19th century version of American exceptionalism really means. And to Union veterans, I'm finding more and more and more that they really genuinely embrace this idea that there is a fundamental equality, at least before the law, and that efforts, a liberating army, they strive to make that a reality. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they say things that, from our 21st century perspective, are cringeworthy when it comes to some racist assumptions. They're gonna believe things that to us seem like, oh my God, these guys are horrible people. But and I'm not letting them off the hook for that, at all. But at the same time, I do believe that they embrace this notion that we did something. One veteran I quoted in the review of this book, and I forget his name, and I need to look it up. But he said that we didn't fight just to save the Union alone. We fought it to make a Union worth saving. And I really love that line because it means something to him. So what are your thoughts on this idea of American exceptionalism?
All right, boy, big questions. You're gonna love my next book, which again I hope comes out this year, because it's about why the men of the Union went to war, and I talk about their evolving abolitionist beliefs, which, as we know, changed dramatically during the war.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about their belief in the republic and what an actual republic is. The fact they were way ahead of their civilian counterparts in terms of realizing what the war was about. People don't recognize, to the extent that we're talking about, that you had almost 3 million men in the service fighting a war whose motivations had changed during the war itself. From the Crittenden Resolution making explicit that slavery was not the reason why the war was being fought, to the National Union Party platform in 1864, making it abundantly clear that slavery was the reason, advocation of African American troops, advocation for the 13th Amendment, all the 100%.
And the election's a referendum on this.
Absolutely.
64, right?
And look at the soldiers' vote. If that's not a referendum, again, the Army of the Potomac, they vote overwhelmingly against George McClellan because they were disgusted by the Democratic platform. And what more evidence do you need? Shandra Manning wrote beautifully bad in her book.
Mhm.
So, and again, you're making a great point. The separation of abolitionist beliefs from beliefs about equality. So that's why I always point out when I talk about the unfinished work that Lincoln talked about during Gettysburg Address, that was not equality. That was freedom. That
Mhm.
was abolition. The men of the Union, I fully believe, and again, I think I gave great evidence for it, as you've done, and others, well, a few others, that they took the next step, that the second water fight was equality, and that this was not lip service. These men lived this. I mean, look at the number of men who I point out who volunteered for the Freedmen's Bureau. And again, the Veteran Reserve Corps turned out to be an ace in the hole because
Mhm.
men like the Left Arm Corps and others stayed in the service, missing an arm or a leg or desperately ill because they so believed in the Freedmen's Bureau. If that's not a validation of exactly what you're saying, I don't know what is. So this wasn't just old men looking back and rationalizing what they had done. Because first of all, the writing is contemporaneous. That's number one. The Left Arm Corps left the most amazing essays, which again will be the focus of my next book, of what they wrote in 1865 and 1866 on topics nobody asked them to write about.
Mhm.
And all the things you're mentioning. And their grasp, and these were common soldiers, most of whom had a common, school education. But they absolutely believed in the concepts of equality under the law. They believed in what a republic stands for. They understood in great depth why American democracy was different. And let's also not forget something else. It was not that old a country in 1861.
Mhm.
And many of them had grandfathers who had fought in the Revolutionary War. And so again, context is important. Now, you also made another great point about attitudes. I use words and statements that are verbatim, which I feel is very important because people need to know what these men were saying at the time. Now, to your point about racist attitudes in the 19th and 20th century, you're absolutely right. But not everybody felt the same way,
Mhm.
which is also an important distinction to make. And that's why I wrote with the idea of exploding some of the myths, frankly, that Union soldiers turned their backs, as you pointed out, on their African American colleagues and by extension, African Americans. As we know, that is not the case. And I think there has been some attempt to force that narrative, even though there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, which is what I try to amass for my book. And I presume, Keith, you notice a lot of it is brand new material no one had presented before. And one of the most dramatic ones was Edward Hayes's speech at Gettysburg,
Mhm.
which I unearthed, where he talked about war without purpose is murder. I mean, how eloquent. I mean, he was one of the highest ranking members of the Left Arm Corps. And he made that point that if you're not fighting for something that is of value, that is uplifting, then war is simply murder, organized murder. This is a Union veteran writing in the late 19th century. That's a
Mhm.
very modern concept. The second thing I do want to mention is my work on Union veterans is in keeping with my work on all veterans of all modern wars. And by the way, I've been criticized in some quarters, which has frankly stunned me, about using 21st century knowledge and things that we've learned when I discuss Civil War veterans. I don't understand that, quite frankly, because the Civil War veterans I've studied are very much in line with veterans in the 21st century. And when I talk to veterans groups, they are stunned by the material from Union veterans, how much it resonates with how they feel, the warrior identity, the fact that they trust the men or women next to them. Veterans often have more difficulty reintegrating to civilian society, not because of war, but because of the absence of war. because the emotions are impossible to replicate. And by the way, I can give you a great example from the Civil War. One of the most famous Civil War veterans was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He
Hmm.
had a very difficult time in civilian life. First of all, physically,
Hmm.
but secondly, emotionally, he had a very difficult time. And which is not surprising. And he held on to, and in some ways started to rewrite history, which he was criticized for, because the war was so important to him. I mean, this man stood, on the precipice of Gettysburg,
Hmm.
feeling that the entire battle was on his shoulders. So, you know, these are concepts that are not unique to the men of the Union. And there are portrayals in, our time that make this point. And again, we talked about Band of Brothers, we've talked about the Pacific, the great documentaries that have come out about Vietnam. By the way, Ken Burns did a fantastic documentary on World War II that for some reason I don't think got nearly the attention it should have gotten.
It was a
As his
good documentary, by the way. That was
which was
well done.
which was terrific.
Hmm.
And for some reason, I don't know why. Um, I'm not exactly sure why that was. But and of course, his magnificent documentary on Vietnam, which it was. I will point out that in both his World War II and Vietnam documentary, he relied on the combatants themselves
Hmm.
and civilians themselves. And don't take this the wrong way, but there's no historians in his World War II and Vietnam War documentary.
That's right. I'm gonna give him a compliment. Actually, sometimes I wonder. It's no offense taken. Believe me. Sometimes I wonder what historians are up to. Listen, I'm in with the historians. I'm fine with historians. I am one myself, right? But I mean, I sometimes I think that historians get caught up in things that may not have mattered to an ordinary grunt in combat. You
Yeah,
know.
I mean, one of the most compelling things in a Civil War documentary was that amazing letter from Ballou,
Hmm.
Elijah Hunt Rhodes' marvelous journal, Sam
Hmm.
Watkins' journal.
Hmm.
Again, primary source, and they were wonderful. And I think one of the great things Burns did was bring those things to people's attention, but it's their own words.
Right.
And
No,
I
we
pray,
have to give Burns credit for that, and I know that there's been people who have called for an updated documentary on the Civil War because Burns's stuff is from the '90s and it's a little bit dated and it doesn't include a number of voices. But to give him credit where credit is due, he really brought that war alive to millions and millions of television viewers who became suddenly interested in the Civil War, and not just the war told from the old, battles and leaders version of it,
right.
but really from the people in the ranks. And I think that was, I mean, just a monumental achievement.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And people, I mean, people seem to think it was a movie. I mean, those are all still photos. I mean,
Yeah, I know. He also kind of like the pan left, pan right. He kind of revolutionized documentary filming because everybody uses that
yeah, everyone uses it now.
now. Hmm.
And, it's interesting with him because I like some of his shorter documentaries.
Hmm.
And again, I did mention the two, which I think are marvelous, but his two-part documentary on Jack Johnson was absolutely marvelous.
Hmm.
And his brother, who I think is an underrated documentarian, did a marvelous one on New York City with one of the best episodes on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire,
Mm. I
which
haven't
of
seen that
course
one
led
yet.
to all the changes in the labor laws.
Right.
This is what whether you're a trained historian or someone who is a history lover with other disciplines you draw upon,
Hmm.
history is so fascinating. It drives me crazy when I watch movies based on right, and you know what I'm going to say, historical events, and they change the history. And history
Yeah.
is inevitably much more interesting.
The only
And
person that can get away with that to me is Quentin Tarantino. I think he can get away with it because he's Quentin Tarantino. But I know precisely what you mean. Yeah,
yeah,
it
I've
is.
told people, like with Gangs of New York, I said, look, watch the documentary on the New
Yeah.
York City draft riots. This is not the one to watch.
Yeah, where the U.S. Navy shells Manhattan. I
Yeah, I mean,
particularly like that.
as opposed to the real story. They
Mhm.
pulled Union soldiers off the battlefield of Gettysburg.
Yeah, yeah. It was only, that
You
was only
shipped them back
weeks later.
weeks later. I try so hard to use the primary sources.
Hmm.
I try very hard to use what we've learned since, because all of us stand on the soldiers, interesting slip, stand on the shoulders of people before us.
Hmm.
And, as I'm sure most of us have, of a certain generation, we all started with Bruce Catton.
Yeah.
And,
There's
yeah,
my
right.
entire shelf of Bruce Catton books,
As,
including
as do I.
this one that my grandparents gave me in 1980 as a Christmas present.
The
That
hardcovers,
is, I
right?
still have. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They gave me that. It was my first Civil War book, and that's in the place of honor up there.
Yeah, I do the same thing. Now,
Hmm.
some of his stuff, I mean, I do a lot of writing on the Veteran Reserve Corps,
Hmm.
which, was I mentioned, which I talk about in One War to Fight. And in my next book, I do a lot about the origin of the Veteran Reserve Corps, which of course was given the worst name in history, the Invalid Corps. I would like to
I
start
know.
with an Invalid Corps.
That's terrible.
But they did change it after a year.
Hmm.
His discussions of the Invalid Corps was so negative.
Hmm.
Um, they were hardly complimentary. But even he changed some of his ideas after Fort Stevens and other things took place. But his beautiful writing,
Oh
and he
yeah,
was such
I
a
mean, it's
wonderful writer. And
unmatched.
as with so many awards, and he wins the Pulitzer Prize for his third book. He did not win it for what I thought was his best book, which was the middle book,
Hmm.
Glory Road.
Hmm.
I thought was much better than the third book, which ended at Appomattox. I thought Glory Road was marvelous.
Yeah.
But as with many trilogies, the middle one is usually the best, such as The Empire Strikes Back clearly being the best of the Star
I
Wars
know
films.
that's where we disagree. I can't agree with you on that one. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's my belief. The episode 5, I guess, I thought it was the richest story.
It's a good,
Um,
yeah. I don't know. I'm a purist. See, I get into art fights with my students about this all the time because they're young and they don't understand. But there is only one Star Wars, right? There's no episode 4. There's
no,
Star Wars, and then after the fact, there's all the
I, I don't disagree with that, but
others.
I also think The Godfather 2 is better than Godfather 1.
Ooh, yeah. There's some good. The Godfather. That would be a great debate because The Godfather 2 is an excellent, excellent, excellent film, which also won the Academy Award for Best Picture,
Yeah,
I think. Right?
deservedly.
Yeah,
But again,
yeah.
I mentioned that with Catton because with Catton's trilogy, um, Stillness Appomattox
Hmm.
is very different than Glory Road.
Hmm.
And again, Glory Road ends with the Gettysburg Address. I believe he said, and then the tall man got up to speak. I mean, it gives you chills.
Yeah,
And
his it is it's right, and his description of the beginning of the fight at Gettysburg when the as he has the first army the first brigade, first division, first corps of the Army of Potomac is sort of
yeah,
lined up on Emmitsburg Road, ready to make that left hand turn and go into
right.
battle.
And
That
again,
is some of the
it's
most
Rufus
beautiful
Dawes,
writing. Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And
there's Dawes again, exactly, the Iron
there's
Brigade. This is
Dawes, who
one of
was
the most
everywhere.
beautiful
It was
writing.
like,
Beautiful.
yeah. So, and people have built on that. I think Stephen Sears is very much in the tradition
Hmm.
of um, um, Catton. I think a better historian, frankly. I think some of his material is better.
Hmm.
Um, but we have. I think one of the things I'm trying to do, and you've been so supportive of this idea, is bring the same love of the history, bring the same background, and the same academic rigor. Let's not forget that
Hmm.
coming from a different disciplines doesn't mean the academic rigor is any less
Oh,
in
not at all.
terms of what we present. But the freedom to bring different viewpoints based on different experiences.
Hmm.
Um, it's a pleasure when folks like you are open to this and do celebrate that. But this has not been easy in terms of getting my work out. It has not been easy in terms of the acceptance in certain circles of the evidence I believe I presented.
Mhm.
And I think there are still barriers, frankly, to
There are. I think you're right. I think that there's gatekeeping sometimes involved in academia, which is frustrating. And thanks, and I appreciate the props, honestly. But honestly, I think I'm more than open to it. I actively pursue it and embrace it. I think that we need as many different perspectives and viewpoints from different, in the academic rigor in this book. And when I mentioned this in my review, I said, look, you're not an academic historian. You are in the medical field. You're a physician. You're a psychiatrist. And I also went on to say that you are well versed in the literature. You know what
which
you're
I
doing. You
greatly
know the
appreciate.
stuff.
Yeah,
You've done your due diligence. You've done your homework, and you know the work. So I mean,
I was so
there's no
I was
barrier here.
so
There shouldn't be.
I was so appreciative of that because in a couple of other reviews, the first thing people mentioned was I wasn't a historian, and then basically use that
Use it against you.
to, yeah. And
Hmm.
whereas others, such as you, did not see that as a negative. And I do greatly
Frankly, I see it
appreciate.
as a positive. I see it as a positive. I think that if we would, if academics would look beyond academia and bring people in, who have different backgrounds, you're going to have unique perspectives, and it's only going to increase the base body of knowledge. In the end of the day, even if there's disagreement, I mean, which
Which is
surely there
fine,
will be,
which is fine.
right, right.
But bear in mind, I'm also an academic. I mean, I'm a medical academic. And by the way, another one of my fields is epidemiology, which is critical to looking at large populations. I am now very happily teaching at the flagship um, humanities program at the WVU at Shepherd University. I teach honor seminars there, and which has been wonderful. The response of the new generation of students to the material I'm presenting has been so gratifying. And I've even gotten them to take a look at movies that are in black and white. Yeah, I know. Yeah, two of
Quite an
them
accomplishment.
on my recommendation watched the original All Quiet on the Western Front,
Hmm.
which remains an absolute masterpiece. By the way, 3 years after sound came in,
Hmm.
if you can believe that, the film's from 1930, which of course
Hmm.
ends with one of the most powerful images ever in film when Lou Ayres reaches for the butterfly.
Hmm. No,
Um,
it's a beautiful film.
yeah, it's a beautiful film.
Hmm.
So I am encouraged by this, and I think that folks like you, with your credentials, who are so open to um, different viewpoints, different perspectives, is so gratifying. And don't get me wrong, other people have. And the thing that's been terrific about this experience is meeting people when I do the lectures. Because I love to do talks,
Hmm.
and I can't remember too many lectures over the years before the book came out and now where there weren't veterans in the audience.
Hmm.
And you can imagine what this brings because their validation, their acknowledgement, and the things they'll say in the questions. And I can tell you that there have been times that it's gotten quite emotional when I've spoken during the Q&A when they come up to me afterwards and say that giving voice to what they've experienced is so important. And, Catton said that he couldn't speak for the men whom he knew as a child in Michigan because he knew members of the left of the Army of the Potomac.
Hmm.
I can speak for the Left Arm Corps and others because I have their writings. I let them speak for themselves.
Hmm.
And then along with that, put it in the context of what we've learned about going to war, what we've learned now. And they knew that history would watch. They took, as you know, in your work, They talked about history. They talked about their legacy. You know, one of the most tragic things about the lost cause becoming the dominant interpretation of the Civil War, this happened while the men of the Union were alive.
Mm-hmm.
They watched this happen and tried desperately to stop it. And of
Yeah,
course,
they
the
fought
last
against
chapter,
it.
they fought against it. I mean, look, my last chapter is all about the Lee statue,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, almost no one's mentioned in the reviews of the book, which is quite interesting. You know, I give the entire story of how the statue ended up there in the first place
Mm-hmm.
and their bitter fight against it. But the Grand Army of the Republic never formally protested it, which showed what had happened to the Grand Army of the Republic since they had stood against the color line.
Mm-hmm.
Times had changed. There had been the war in the late 19th century, which talked about Manifest Destiny and others, as we know. And of course, Jim Crow had been declared the law of the land. You know, Plessy versus Ferguson set civil rights back decades,
Mm-hmm.
and of course I focus on that. But I also did something else in One More War to Fight, which you noted in others. I have Union veterans throughout the book who did things based on their experience, such as Joseph Foraker from Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
who fought against the unjust cashiering of the black troopers in Texas by Teddy Roosevelt, a story that's almost been lost in many ways to history. And I focused on what Foraker did because of his experience as a Union soldier, what his racial attitudes had become. As he so beautifully said, he's not defending them because they're African American. He's defending them because they're men
Mm-hmm.
and because they're entitled to that. So again, as you pointed out, as I'm trying to emphasize, racism at a time and place, including now, certainly does not mean that everyone feels the same way, or that there aren't people who have stood against racism. And I think one of the things I tried to make clear in the book is the men of the Union proved to be stalwart in continuing the work that they had begun during the war. And of course, African American veterans was so important in their communities. And they changed so many minds, starting with Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as Frederick Douglass pointed out, Lincoln came from a state with black hoods. Lincoln had very little experience with African Americans. And boy, did the black men of the Union change his mind,
Mm-hmm.
as they did so many people's minds. But when you stand alongside a man and you fight alongside a man, it becomes a very different perspective when the color is red. And that's the color that matters. You know, Carl Melantes writes beautifully about this. You know, these are the things I try to incorporate, and I do them in my talks, and I try to incorporate in my writings, because I think these issues are so important now. And certainly the issues about America as a republic, what the law means, the use of courts. I mean, could this be more important now? So reaching back to history, I know you feel the same way, is so instructive as to the present and what happens in the future. Because if we don't learn, if we don't look back and build upon what's been done before, what happens next? I really do believe that.
I think those are words to live by. And actually, you know what? I think that is a perfect soundbite for the trailer on this show, and a great place to end too. Steve, thanks so much for being on. Did you know that this is the very first episode after a 3-year hiatus? Just a little over 3 years. I when the pandemic started, I decided to give the podcast a rest for a while. After 120 plus episodes, and I thought I'd give it a break for a minute. And that break, a short break, turned into a 3-year break, and now I'm back. And I'm so happy that you agreed to be the very first guest on the relaunch.
I am truly honored to be your first guest since, I mean, it is a pleasure. I'm a great fan of your work.
Thank you.
And I'd love to come back on again. This was a great discussion.
Yeah, I think so too. It's very insightful stuff, very enlightening stuff. We talk about the universal experience of war. We've got a good conversation about the literature, and even got to talk about some film. Which, by the way, the thing that you just said about Forca reminded me of, and if I can find the citation in my notes, I'll send it to you. When The Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, which is a lost cause movie. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes of the film, for Christ's sake.
And of course, I mentioned it in the book.
Yeah, right. And I love the Union veterans who criticize that film. You would expect the NAACP in its very earliest
Right.
years, formative stages, to criticize the film, but when white Union veterans criticize it, to me that said so much. Because they did. They really. I mean, how are you depicting Union soldiers as rapists and thieves and
Well,
burning
they
people's
did the
houses down?
same thing in Gone with the Wind.
Hmm.
The one Union veteran is a rapist.
Yeah. Right. Right. So they had a lot to say about that. So anyway, Steve, thanks again for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
It was a real pleasure speaking. All right. Thanks, man.
Take care.
Okay, crew, I hope you liked that. I certainly liked it. We had a great time, great conversation, even got to talk about movies and all kinds of other fun stuff. Again, the book is One More War to Fight by Stephen Goldman. I recommend getting it, and I also hope that you subscribe to this channel for more great stuff. Okay, peace.